Frantz Fanon's claim is that the inferiority was manufactured, not native to the people carrying it, not waiting in them before anybody arrived. And when he went looking for the factory, one of the places he found it was a stack of children's comic books, which sounds like a joke until you read the passage. The weekly comics, Tarzan, explorer stories, the things a kid reads for fun. Here's how he puts it in Richard Philcox's translation. Fanon wrote, quote, "They are written by white men for white children," end quote. Then he follows those same magazines into the French Antilles, where black children were reading them too. And in those stories, he says, the villains are drawn one way: the wolf, the devil, the savage, black or Indian, every time. And Fanon's point is that a child identifies with the good guy, the same way any reader is meant to. So the black child in the Antilles becomes the explorer. And in Fanon's telling, that means becoming the one the wicked Negroes are about to eat. Those last words are his, written in the register of the comics he's describing, not his description of the children. He's on the side of the hunters, and the thing being hunted has his face. This isn't only a fact about 1952. It changes how we read an explanation that still feels sufficient. The one saying a group's condition was already in them before anybody did anything to them. A thing assembled from objects with publication dates has authors and a manufacturing history, and both can be examined. Nature settles the question before anybody has to answer for it. So here's the question this episode answers. Where was the condition actually made? The route runs through a fight Fanon picked with the man who wrote that idea down as a clinical finding, then onto the factory floor, and then back onto Fanon's own pages where the same test turns on its author. Start with Mannoni, because none of this matters unless his position was serious. It was. Octave Mannoni wrote a book on the psychology of colonization, and Fanon spends a chapter taking it apart. Before he lays a finger on it, he calls the analysis intellectually honest and credits Mannoni with grasping real things about colonizer and native as a man who had met the colonial situation firsthand. That's the setup, not throat clearing. Whatever's wrong here isn't wrong because a bad man wrote it. Mannoni wanted to place the dependency complex before the colonial relation. Colonization didn't create it on his account. It met it, and he put it at its strongest. Only some peoples can be colonized, he argued, and only the ones with the need for it. And he pointed to local stories that had supposedly predicted pale visitors arriving by sea with gifts. His evidence was that an adult Malagasy, set down somewhere unfamiliar and alone, could become vulnerable to a textbook inferiority complex, from which, as he put it, the seed of the thing must have been sitting in the man since he was small. Read that as reasoning, not a verdict, because the reasoning is where it breaks. Follow the order. The man is moved somewhere he has no one. Then the symptom appears. Mannoni concludes the cause was in him all along, waiting. Nothing in the passage Fanon quotes requires that. The isolation could be doing the whole job, and in those lines, no comparison is run and no alternative tested. Fanon answers with an analogy from surgery. Picture a patient with varicose veins who stands 10 hours a day. You can say the veins are the problem, a weakness in the walls, and that the standing merely worsens an existing condition. Say it that way, Fanon points out, and the employer's responsibility comes out very limited. The standing still did damage on that account. It worsened something already there. The explanation isn't neutral, because somebody downstream of it is holding a bill they no longer have to pay. He also turns Mannoni's rule against him. Mannoni had written that a color-based inferiority complex appears only in a minority inside a group of another color. Then look at who's in the minority in Fanon's two examples. His own figures. 200 white people in Martinique above 300,000 people of color, 2 million white South Africans over almost 13 million black South Africans. On Mannoni's rule, the colonizer is the one who should be developing the complex. And Fanon's observation is the reverse. Not one black South African, he says, has ever looked at that white minority and felt himself the superior party. So he draws the conclusion the chapter exists for. Fanon wrote, quote, "Let us have the courage to say, it is the racist who creates the inferiorized," end quote. Agent first, condition second. Somebody does the making, and he pairs that line with the second one running the other way, that being made inferior is the matching half of somebody else feeling superior. Two halves of one transaction. So the inferiority isn't a property anybody has. It's something being done to them, continuously, by somebody. And notice what it cost him. Fanon refuses the whole frame in which racism comes in degrees. More here, less there. He says instead that a society is racist or it isn't. No degrees, no league table. No more here than there. Hold on to that, because it comes back to bite him later in this same book, and I'll show you where. But first, let me be fairer to Mannoni than Fanon is. Breaking a proof isn't proving the opposite. Fanon shows Mannoni can't establish the complex was there before the French. He doesn't show it wasn't. He writes the fair version himself at the chapter's end, that on the pre-colonial version, Mannoni hasn't the slightest basis for any conclusion. True. And, my point rather than his, nobody has that basis. Not Mannoni, not Fanon either. Except Mannoni doesn't rest on the germ. He has material he reads as evidence of something older than the colony, and it comes from sleep. If his reading of it holds, the dependency complex has a foundation, and Fanon's objection is a debating point. Now the complaint about method turns into something heavier. I keep circling back to one sentence, so let me build to it. Mannoni reports 7 dreams from Malagasy people. Children, Fanon says, and 1 adult. 6 dominated by terror. The adult, a cook, is chased by an angry black bull and climbs a tree. A 13-year-old walking in the woods meets 2 black men who bar the way and show their rifles. Mannoni reads these as symbols. The 2 black men become the father and the ancestor. The rifle becomes a phallus. The terror becomes something welling up out of Malagasy tradition itself, out of ancestor worship and family structure. His rebuttal runs for pages, but one line in it is devastatingly specific. Fanon wrote, quote, "The Senegalese soldier's rifle is not a penis, but a genuine Lebel 1916 model," end quote. A make and a model year. Mannoni's reading floats the fear free of any particular time. Fanon sets it back down on a specific weapon, carried by specific men, during a specific repression. Put a date on the object, and you can ask who was holding it. Because of when this was. In 1947, there was an insurrection in Madagascar, and the repression that followed was severe. Fanon prints 80,000 killed, 1 inhabitant in 50. That's his figure in 1952. It sits near an early official French estimate, and the count is fiercely contested. Other figures far below it, and some well above. I won't hand you any of them as the answer. He reinforces the reading with trial testimony in a footnote. A witness named Rakutu VOW, testifying in August, alleges being made to kneel, his head forced into a drum of dirty water until he was about to faint, lifted for air, pushed under again, whipped, dragged up and down a cement staircase by 2 Senegalese soldiers under a French officer's orders, arms tied behind his back. And when he asked to be treated in a manner worthy of France, the officer told him this was how France treats you. Fanon notes the witness was sentenced to death. So what does the symbolic reading cost? Read the rifle as an ancestral symbol, and you relocate the fear inside Malagasy tradition, and lift the soldiers the testimony describes out of the picture. Fanon's own conclusion is that the black bull and the black men in those dreams are the Senegalese in the criminal investigation department. It doesn't just get it wrong, it removes the date. And removing the date removes the culprit. He reads one more thing in those dreams, and it's what they teach. To leave the ordinary path, he says, is to meet the bull that sends you running home. He hears an instruction in that. Stay quiet. Stay in your place. The alibi, then, was never only an excuse offered afterward. It was a lesson delivered in advance, and those dreams at least had a repression close at hand to be read against. The harder question opens the next chapter. Very often, Fanon says, the person who breaks has never come into contact with white people at all. Put a date on that object, and there's nobody holding it. Fanon's sixth chapter opens on a problem its own starting model can't reach. He's a clinician, working in a consulting room, and the model he sets out is Freud's. A neurosis traces back to an experience that was lived, then expelled from memory and left working in the unconscious. So he asks the obvious question. Was there a real traumatism? A father beaten or lynched in front of the child? He answers, no. On the trauma model, there's nothing left to find. So Fanon proposes a different route and gives it a name. Collective catharsis, which means a society building itself a place to dump its aggression and handing that place to its children as entertainment. Not the only explanation anyone could offer, but the one he backs, and its advantage is that it needs no violent event in the child's own life. The violence is all still there. It is just moved into the pictures. He inventories it. The comics, where aggression gets discharged onto the villains, the wolf and the devil and the savage, who Fanon says are always drawn black or Indian. Then the schoolroom, where Antillean children are made to recite, over and over, that their ancestors were the Gauls. A sentence about French descent, said out loud by black children in the Caribbean. Fanon notes in a footnote that the whole thing raises a smile, that its comedy is readily granted, and that the long-term consequences never get mentioned. Then the cinema. A Tarzan film in the Antilles, where the young black viewer sides with Tarzan against the black people on screen. And the same viewer in a European cinema, where, as Fanon tells it, the white audience files him in with the savages. I'm paraphrasing rather than quoting, because the copy of that page I could check is missing words. He treats the observation as settled. It isn't. And I'd rather say so than let him have it. The comics and film tickets are bought, paid for, entered into for pleasure. The recitation is compulsory, delivered by a school. 2 tracks, one you pay to get into and one you're marched into. And the one you're marched into, Fanon notes, always raises a smile. Then Fanon writes the sentence that carries the argument, as a correction to a phrase he thinks people reach for too fast. Fanon wrote, quote, "We said rather too quickly that the black man feels inferior. The truth is that he is made to feel inferior," end quote. Feels is a report about somebody's interior, and it invites sympathy and private repair. Is made is a report about somebody else's activity, which means there was somebody doing it. Now, something in that neighborhood has been followed over time, which is more than Fanon managed with his own word association exercise. Announced this July in American Psychologist, Michael Rizzo and Marjorie Rhodes followed nearly 600 white American children, 4 to 8, for a year. The children whose favorite shows and films had fewer black characters were less inclined to play with black peers. They held less favorable views of black children, And they were more likely to say that racial inequality comes from what people inherently are, rather than from the circumstances around them. The authors read the relationship as self-perpetuating, biased media and biased preference feeding each other, though that reading is their interpretation of the pattern rather than something the design can prove. What it is not. One study on white American children rather than colonized Antillean children, and it doesn't test what actually interested Fanon, a child identifying against himself. It follows children rather than assigning them to conditions, so it shows association, not cause. And it says nothing about what predated colonization, Mannoni's whole claim. It doesn't prove anybody right, but look at what it chose to measure. Whether a child explains inequality by inherent difference or by environment. A close contemporary analog of the distinction this argument turns on, and 74 years later somebody put numbers on which way children lean and what they'd been watching. And one part of the chapter changes its temperature. Having found the damage in comics and school books, Fanon asked for magazines and songs made specially for Black children, and special history books, at least through elementary school. A man who has just diagnosed something enormous, asking for better school books. But all of it rests on one assumption he hasn't defended. If the pictures in a child's head come down through ancestry rather than through the newsstand, better books are a much smaller lever than he thinks. And the opponent, Fanon, picks here, Jung, said exactly that. Jung's idea was that underneath your own private mind sits a shared one, stocked with images every human being is born already carrying. Fanon says Jung puts that shared layer in inherited cerebral matter. Inherited, in the brain, passed down. That is Fanon's characterization of Jung, and it's the version he argues with. And if that's right, the last movement loses most of its force, because an image arriving through ancestry isn't something a publisher could be asked to stop printing. Fanon takes it out of the body. Fanon wrote, quote, "The collective unconscious is quite simply the repository of prejudices, myths, and collective attitudes of a particular group." End quote. Repository, a place where things get put. They arrived from somewhere at some point, and none of it is in anybody's blood. And he names the error. Jung confuses instinct with habit. Instinct is what you're born with. Habit is what you pick up. And mistaking the second for the first is how an acquired thing starts looking eternal. Fanon has a memory that shows the acquiring. At 14, watching the Allies push the Italian army back at Benghazi, he crowed about it to a friend whose father was Italian, and the friend was embarrassed, and so was he. Both of us, he writes, victims of cultural imposition. He also lands a real methodological objection. Every population Jung went to, Fanon argues, had already met Europeans, and mostly not gently. He names them: Pueblo Indians from Arizona, Black Kenyans in British Africa. Every one of those doors had been opened before Jung got there, so nothing he found there could show a pre-contact origin. Something older might still be in there, but his evidence couldn't reach it. Jung wanted to reach the childhood of the world, Fanon says, and only got as far as the childhood of Europe. Then Fanon does something the owner of a hypothesis doesn't have to do. He puts a date on his claim. He predicts that the Jews who settled in Israel will, inside 100 years, be carrying a different shared inheritance from the one they brought out of the countries that expelled them. That's a dated prediction with a deadline on it. So how's it done? Two honest halves. One premise converged with later developmental research. In a 2024 Daedalus article, Andrew Meltzoff and Walter Gilliam put it that children are not born harboring racial biases, but they are born learning. Convergence, not lineage. That article doesn't cite Fanon, and I won't claim an influence the source doesn't show. The other half is the prediction. Neither of the contemporary sources I've cited tested, and he never said what you would measure to settle it. The claim he built to be checkable is the one still sitting there unchecked. Take the acquisition claim seriously, and it has an implication most readers flinch from. And Fanon doesn't flinch from it. If a collective unconscious is handed to you by your culture, and the culture handed to the Antillean was Europe's, then the Antillean was handed Europe's picture of the black man too. Fanon says it flatly. He writes that the Antillean has absorbed every one of Europe's stock images, the whole cast of heroes and monsters, and that it is therefore normal for an Antillean to fear and despise black people. Normal. Not a moral failure, not a betrayal. The expected output of the machine, working correctly. So if you came to this chapter for an account of white racism, the book half invites the mistake and then refuses it. Much of it is about a black population's contempt for itself, and why that is not a defect in the population. The argument then is in good shape. Historically acquired, through culture, which means it could have been acquired differently. That's a satisfying place to stand, which is why the next thing I want to examine is Fanon's own evidence, using the test he just taught us. There's a comfortable place to stop. Fanon was right. Ahead of his time, science caught up. You've heard why the second half of that won't hold. Here's the part the book forbids. Take the test. Ask what an explanation excuses and who was rewarded for finding it. Now pointed at these chapters. Take 3 of his own exhibits. Fanon says it will be easy to demonstrate that 97% of Antillean families couldn't produce a single case of the family drama Freud built his system on, the child's rivalry with the parent. He demonstrates nothing and cites nobody. And even the wording is fragile, on another damaged page. He reports slipping the word Negro into free association tests with about 500 white Europeans over 3 or 4 years. 1 in 50, he says, came back with Nazi or SS. That detail is worth having, though the full list of answers doesn't survive in my copy. What isn't there is any instrument, any controls, or any published data. And here's the strange part. When he wants to demolish somebody else's fantasy, he's ruthless about evidence. A writer called Corno published a passage reducing the black man to a sexual organ, and Fanon answers by citing a figure from a Dr. Pell's, then Test 2's anatomy manual, giving the same figure for Europeans. Then the line that matters. Nobody is convinced by these facts. He knows measurement doesn't dislodge a fantasy, and still doesn't turn that on his own pages. He tells you this about himself back in chapter 4, mid-demolition. Fanon wrote, quote, "I did not want to be objective," end quote. He adds that being objective would have been dishonest, and that he found it impossible. I respect that sentence, and he is careful elsewhere. He marks the trial testimony as testimony and credits the closing case to another doctor's ward, which is why the percentages stand out. They arrive with no instrument, no controls, and no data, in the same voice as the parts he did source. And now we come back to the binary I asked you to hold on to. A society is racist or it isn't. And he says it's utopian to try to sort one kind of inhuman behavior from another. That colonial racism is no different from any other racism. That's chapter 4. Then in chapter 6, he spends pages distinguishing anti-Semitism from anti-black racism. The Jew attacked through religious identity, history, and race. The black man through the body. And then writes that equating anti-Semitism with Negrophobia seems to be an error of analysis. Hedged, but he's right the second time. So the binary is one his own later analysis complicates, and the cost is specific. In neither of these chapters does he say what would count as meeting that bar, so nobody can test whether a given society clears it. not a critic, and not him. Then the part I'm not going to soften. The instinct is to hurry past it, or reach for the century as an excuse. In this same chapter, there are pages about women that aren't merely dated. They're indefensible. Fanon takes women's fear of black men and reinterprets it as a wish, and writes a sentence proposing that some women are asking for the thing they fear. I'm not going to read it to you. It's on the page, it's his, and no amount of context turns it into an argument. In the same chapter, he explains men who fear black men as repressed homosexuals, and he writes that he never observed overt homosexuality in Martinique, and treats his own failure to see it as evidence for his theory. That parallel is mine, rather than his, but it is the same shape of reasoning he spent chapter 4 taking apart. And then, having built an entire psychology of the white woman's fantasies, he gets to the obvious question about black women. And what he says is that we know nothing about her. I want to be exact about that sentence, because it's easy to make it more flattering than it is. In its place, it isn't a confession about the rest of the book. It's a man admitting he has nothing at the end of an analysis where he had plenty to say about everybody else. Now set that beside what he charged Mannoni with. Mannoni took a fear that a situation had produced and located it inside the people carrying it. That is the charge. And in this chapter, the prosecutor does it too. A woman's fear is reinterpreted as her own wish, which puts the defect inside her and leaves whoever produced the fear with very little to answer for. That will be the verdict, except the chapter has one more thing in it. So, where was the thing actually made? On Fanon's account, in childhood, out of ordinary culture. Some bought, some compulsory. Comics, films, a sentence recited in a classroom. And the rival explanation, the one putting a group's condition in the group's nature, can do liability work while looking like description. You spot it by asking who stops owing something the moment you accept it. That's the part you carry out of here, and it's why the argument matters. Because what culture handed over, culture can hand over differently. Here is the contradiction that answer opens. Fanon's chapter began by asking why a black child raised in a perfectly ordinary family comes apart on contact with the white world. It ends somewhere else entirely. It ends with a 19-year-old white French woman in a psychiatric ward. Her case is the last thing in the chapter. Fanon didn't treat her. He takes it from the doctor who ran the women's ward and offers it as illustration rather than proof. She came in with severe motor tics around her eyes and forehead and involuntary shouting. She'd been placed in domestic service, living away from home. In therapy, she kept seeing circles closing in on her, growing and shrinking to the rhythm of a black drum. Underneath them, a terror of imaginary black men she'd carried since she was 10 or 12. Where that came from is the part I can't get out of my head. Her father was a veteran of the French colonial army, and in the evenings, he played black music on the radio. The drums carried through the house while she lay in bed. Her siblings found the weak spot and frightened her with it. And the cannibal came from the place Fanon has been pointing at all chapter, the comics. Fanon's conclusion is that what made her ill was the fear itself, made worse by circumstances he calls predetermined. And he doubts she's ready to live a normal social life. His own account of her names her father, her siblings, the job away from home, a whole stack of circumstances. But in that stack, on his account, are the comic book cannibals. The pictures were in there with everything else, doing their part. That's the direction the chapter never set out to describe, which is where I leave it. If Fanon's right that this is acquired culture, it's answerable at the level of what children get handed, and a remedy stopping at private self-work is incomplete, because part of the cause sits outside the person. But hold his chapters to his own standard, an unsourced percentage, a survey with no instrument, one borrowed case, a binary he later complicates, and what he's got is a hypothesis, not a finding. The most useful thing isn't the verdict, it's the question, which works on him, which leaves the thing I can't settle. The test came out of his own pages. He ran it on Mannoni, he ran it on Jung, and as far as I can find in these 2 chapters, he never turned it on his own account of what women feel and why. So when you take it out of here and use it, and I think you should, you are picking up a tool its own maker could not hold steady. Whether that tells you something about the tool or only about the hand is the part I genuinely cannot decide.